I like that beat. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael. This is Toby, and we're glad to have you here. And we're going to talk about 8K and the benefits of RAW and 8K workflow. Now, some of you might have been in the last session, which was kind of a tornado of a bunch of things about resolution. And one of the last questions by some guy named Stuart, who asked a great question, was about how to apply the actual codec itself, the actual color, the actual workflow. And Toby owns a company called Cheat, and he's a colorist, and he just did a series for Netflix that he's going to be talking about and kind of going over some of the workflow components, because as Stuart said, who I will continue to reference even though I'm not friend. Hey, Stuart, welcome back. So Stuart is our mascot for this afternoon, and what Stuart pointed out was there is a delta between getting high resolution because we know it's good and we like it and it looks pretty, if that's your jam, and how to make it workflow and how to make it inexpensive so it's efficient. And we're going to talk about those principles specifically here. So I'm going to turn it over to Toby to start talking about his show. And take it away, Toby.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. So I was the colorist on the show. The two DPs were Justin Brown and Ben Fordsman. Justin Brown set the look of the show over the first 4.5 episodes, and then Ben took over the show. I've been working with Justin for about 10 years since film school, so we've developed a pretty close working relationship and a sort of mutual understanding of what we both like in images. So when we came onto this show together, it was quite exciting. It's our first TV show. So we wanted to find the absolute best workflow and best color pipeline that we could possibly get, because I think it's the first TV show finished 8K
from
RAW
8K.
in
And this
ever.
was early with heliums, which were brand new at the time.
So it was a brand new camera. We did some tests. We did some tests on 35mm, did some tests on the Alexa and the helium. And the helium was chosen after the result of those tests. And we referenced those tests later on. We basically wanted to get the absolute most that we could, because we were going for quite a strong look, quite a filmy look. We needed to sort of emulate the films that have inspired us as cinematographers and as colorists. And I wanted to make sure that I had everything that I could possibly get out of this sensor. So we shot 8K, also because we wanted the full frame, so that we'd have the most information that we could work with. Now, the benefits of having all that information is you can choose what to do with it. If you want a really sharp image, you can have a really sharp image. If you don't, the benefits of having that extra resolution, there's a lot from a color grading perspective. So I can get better keys, tighter keys, better tracking. It was an extremely low budget production. Justin was running around a lot. And we had 10 days for the 8 episodes in the grade. So for me, as traditionally a commercials colorist and a features colorist, like a 90-minute feature, I'll do 12 days. This was 3.5 hours in 12 days. So we needed to get our workflow perfect so that we could focus on the creative side of things, not have to worry about, fixing things, making things right as a starting point.
Let me jump in real quick, because you said something really interesting that I think I just want to touch on a little bit more, the noise characteristics.
Yeah.
So a helium has a 3.5 micron pixel, which is ridiculously tiny, tinier than the rods and cones in your eyes. And what essentially that means is, how like when you take a photo with your phone and you scale it down, it doesn't look that noisy, because Facebook is like everything looks good on Facebook, right? Like it just gets tiny and the noise is rendered out. Helium is an exceptional example where when you start with an image, by scaling it down, the noise characteristics are actually 3.5 microns at their largest. When you cut that in half to 4K, they become 1.25 microns.
So yeah, it's the law of averages.
It's the law of averages.
Because you're averaging these pixels, your 4 pixels with a little bit of noise becomes 1 pixel that is basically pure signal. The image, everything that was the detail in the scene that was captured is truly represented without the artifacts of noise. So from a dynamic range, from a creative perspective, those more pixels are getting you access to a potentially better picture. And that's what I'm here to really talk about. And yeah, like I said, better tracking, better keying. As a colorist, to have that information there is great. And in the end, we did a little bit of work on the texture. And to have that high frequency detail to play with, to have that very high resolution to play with and choose what to do with, meant that we could craft the character of the texture for the show as we wanted creatively. And we also added grain as well. So I'm not sure if you've noticed on the show, but that's definitely not noise. That's fairly advanced film grain emulation that we've developed at Cheat, along with the film looks and lookup tables that we've used for that show that I've spent years on. Were adapted for that show. And in a facility that's set up for 8K, it doesn't need to add any time to any workflow. And at Cheat, we're resolution agnostic. We don't charge more for 8K. We don't charge more for 4K. That's a bit of a radical idea from some of the bigger post houses. And we're a pretty radical company. We're called Cheat. It's we're trying to be different. So we set up. The entire system was set up to handle the 8K ahead of the job, because I didn't want to wait for renders. Everything needed to be real time so that we could focus on the creative. We had 1.2 days a grade per episode. I wanted to get to the crux of what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a world. And then obviously the benefits of that 8K is when you scale it down, it is smoother. And if you do want that sharpness, it's there, but you can choose where the sharpness is. And sharpness isn't it's not a constant figure. It's, there's high frequency detail like hair, there's low frequency detail like sort of paws and faces, then there's low frequency detail, which is the shape of the image, the tone. So to have that information there and to have that as a choice for the DP and myself down the line meant we could play with that a little bit in the scenes. And that was pretty cool. The really exciting thing for me, which came out probably soon after the helium, was the new color science in the red. So before Red had their own color spaces. What were they? I can't remember.
They were red color spaces. They were just older ones, but they've redesigned it. So if you've ever shot Red in the past, up until very, very recently, you were using legacy color science, and Red has re-engineered and retooled their sensors with a new color science, which they call IPP2, which sounds bad to say to people that IPP. But if you think about it, it's actually an image processing pipeline, and it's a new version. So some people say, well, I've shot Red cameras and I'm not really into the way they make pictures. You should definitely retest with the new image processing pipeline, because it's dramatically different.
Yeah.
It's ground up different.
It's a completely different starting point for me as a colorist. It's a lot more familiar for me as a colorist. By having this larger color space and this new gamma as well, which I'll get onto in a moment, the retention of saturation tracking, the amount of color in highlights was it's a lot better now than it was before, is what I'm going to say. So the new color space meant that the neon signs in the show, the backlit grass, the practicals, the saturated tungsten practicals in shot, they look natural. They looked like how they were supposed to look. And this, when we started our testing, I was kind of blown away. It was a lot more familiar to what I was used to. And then also the gamma as well. So Red used to have red log film that can contain about 12 stops of latitude, because it's based on the Sinian curve, an old sort of film standard. And they've developed this new gamma that means that you've got a much better relationship between midtones and highlights. So that roll-off in highlights is a lot more natural. You've got access to more data. Again, you can do with it what you will. It gives you that creative freedom.
Sometimes people will assume that one camera will have a lot more dynamic range than another. The truth is, most of these cameras have very, very similar dynamic range, but how they map the dynamic range is different. So what Red has done exceptionally well in IPP2 is remapped how the dynamic range is applied. And that remapping has allowed there to be what some people call the film roll-off, and that's all remapping on top of dynamic range, but they're separate.
These are some images from the show. But here's probably quite a nice example. That tone in the window and that range, that's all natural light. There wasn't a lot of fill there. And we mapped that as we saw fit for the scene.
There I can see some of the grain you added.
Yeah. Which actually developed a little bit throughout the series because we graded the shows over about 2.5 months. So we did change some of the decisions that we'd set early on, which again is a bit of a radical idea for a show, but we did it slowly. So it wasn't too noticeable, but the grain structure is slightly different throughout. Like the saturation tracking and those highlights in the sky, that's something new for me that I hadn't seen with Red cameras before. And with the Helium's massive range, the 8K latitude that gave us a little bit more detail in that noise floor, and then this IPP2 color science, it was sort of a pleasure to work with. We developed on-set looks as well, actually one LUT, just to simplify things. And that was based on IPP2, this new color science, the way that Justin was going to shoot the first 4 episodes, how he was going to expose, how he was going to rate the camera, how we were going to make that work. And that meant that everyone was seeing dailies that were fairly close to the final look, a little bit more contrasty, perhaps. And I think that really helped creatively, and I'd recommend all of you to make sure that your dailies are at least in the ballpark of what the offline is going to be, at least in tone, because people get used to images. Probably less so in feature films. You've got a little bit more control, but in commercials, especially, agency can get really used to these sort of flat, loggish images. So I'd really recommend talking to your colorists and developing on-set looks. Again, that's something that there's no additional cost for that. If you're doing the post with us, we'll work with the DP to create on-set looks. Let me see if I can find a shot with some practicals. There we go. So there, the tracking of the saturation in that lamp compared to previous color sciences on the Red cameras is such a dramatic improvement. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you want to.
A good example that you can visualize in your head is if you think about a lot of digital cameras, and there's quite a few of them. If you think about tail lights in the back of cars, the brake lights, they often look pink or magenta. Can you think of that? If you visualize cameras you've shot with, but we all know car tail lights are red, but they're a very high saturation red because they're meant to see in the day. And a lot of digital cameras will render tail lights or even stoplights as pink. And now with IPP2, stoplights and taillights will be that deep blood red because of the tonal mapping and the dynamic range in the saturation. And of course, that applies to skin tone as well.
Yeah. The amount of information retained in that practical.
Yeah.
This is new for Justin and I on Red cameras. It really is incredible. This is a good example as well. That neon sign.
Yeah.
The retention of that color, while also retaining all the shadow information. So underneath her chin there in the shadow, there was information there, but we were going for sort of an Americana film vibe, and you're going to lose some shadow latitude with that, and that's the look. And I love that, Justin. I think that looks really nice.
Yeah.
So we did throw away a lot of shadow information for the look, but it was there, and so were the highlights. And we could push it as well. If it was, if something was a little under, because it was 8K, the noise is so small, you can push it a little bit further. It's a bit like pushing medium format 3 stops and printing to A4. It's going to look okay. You can't do that with 35. It's lower resolution. It's the same concept. to put it in photographic terms. We actually brightened the sky there. It was a very cloudy day, this scene. It's extremely flat.
I mean, you definitely achieved a very vintage appeal with this. Do you also, just out of curiosity, do you know what optics they were using?
You'll have to talk to Justin about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been embargoed, people.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Yeah, cool. So that's it from me, really.
Well, we'll transition now to another side of this, which ties into what Toby just went over. I'm actually going to break it down to, I think I called it myth-busting 8K. And so I broke it down to 3 little myths that I think are significant in this. And so the first one is that high resolution is going to make images sharper. I'm not going to do it again, but we talked a lot about this in the last session. But the core structure is that the more resolution you have, this is the same resolution of a helium, but it's also, this is the VistaVision format. This is going to increase your magnification, so you have more fall off. So the front of the leaf to the back of the leaf has more 3-dimension, which actually produces the illusion of less sharpness because things tend to be more rounded. And I showed this other example where a circle is digitally made up of polygons, but if the polygons become smaller and smaller, the illusion of roundness becomes greater. And so this is why we are strong in these cues. This is an example of a 3K camera that has, it looks very flat. When I zoom into it, the back to front characteristics are very flat. Where a high resolution camera, the back to front characteristics are very multidimensional, and that gives the cues of depth. And depth cues create roundness and more realism. And these are the properties that audiences can pick on subliminally because they understand the relationship of 3 dimensions because it's biological. We're always looking for dimension because if we don't have dimension, we trip on things and we fall on things. And if you go way back, when tigers were chasing us as we were trying to eat them, we needed multiple dimension visual cues, hyperacuity, to escape being eaten by bears. That's like where this actually comes from. And that's why textures and depth are so important to our vision cues, because it was based on biology and survival. It's also why you might not know what, you might be walking or running. You ever walked on a trail and the trail has got lots of tree roots on it, and you just take one quick glance and you just know where to put your feet? You're not actually placing your feet in every single step because your brain takes a photo and understands through hyperacuity where things go because of dimension, and then you won't trip. It's also why you can be running and you can instantly know that bush has thorns in it and that bush does not have thorns in it. Your brain is picking up all these little cues of how to do that, and that's all part of high resolution. And then I mentioned in the last group that we build these lenses with spherical aberration, and the spherical aberration gets applied in different ways. So these are different aberrations to different lenses, and when you can apply it to red wide gamut, this is the new IPP2 matrix. So if you look at the blue line, that is cinema color. The yellow line is television, Rec 709 color, and the red line is IPP2, red wide gamut. So you can see it's basically all of human vision encoded into the camera. That's why those colors on the neon sign and car tail lights actually work now. Previously, in red cameras, they didn't capture all these colors, and so you had to approximate them, and they would clip out. They would just not be there, and now that problem is eliminated with the new image processing pipeline. And then, of course, when you take this and apply it to a sensor, these 3 examples show how the same chromatic aberration over smaller and smaller pixels creates more depth. So the image on the far right is the helium sensor, the image in the center is a DXL sensor, and the image on the left is a 3.5 micron 8.25 micron sensor, and you can see the same spherical aberration covers more pixels as the pixels get smaller, which produces more of the tonal response that Toby's talking about. If you only have 2 pixels covering it, you have very little control over what the image can do, so you're relying on the camera to be perfect when it's photographing, where on the right you have way more wiggle room because you have so many colors that are being captured and factored together. So I'm going to go now to the second myth. The second myth is you can't have more dynamic range on a sensor with small pixels. You've heard this before, that you need, someone came up to me afterwards like, oh, I heard small pixels can't have dynamic range. Wrong. So here's a picture. Why don't we kill the lights a little bit, if that's possible? So this is actually a Xyla chart, and I took this from, I don't think, does this have a laser pointer? No. Someone have a laser pointer in the audience? Want to point for me? If you do, just point it up there. If you don't, I will make it up. So this is basically a Xyla chart which measures dynamic range. And if we look from left to right, if we sort of count, the first chip is overexposed, so that doesn't count. Hey, that's something like that. So we go 1, count with me, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe 14 on this projector. If I go to the next one, I can see 15, 16, maybe 17 on this projector. Maybe you guys can kind of make out stop 16 and 17. I can also go a little bit crazy. This is going to be gaining it up. But if you look at this is a really interesting test because, again, in the myth that small pixels cannot have dynamic range, the Xyla chart is 21 stops. That's the end of the chart. This Monstro sensor can see all the way to the end of the chart. You can make out the last stop. Granted, the last 5 stops are pretty much all in noise. They're not really usable stops. So I think Art Adams calls those gravy stops, but he says the other stops, he calls them paycheck stops. So there's about 16 or 17 paycheck stops, and then the rest of it is kind of gravy, not really usable. But the point is, these are tiny pixels, and you can see off the chart. The Xyla chart is no longer good enough for dynamic range. We need to make a 30-stop chart now because the sensors are getting so good with this. So that's an important aspect. And if you, here it is, here's the actual raw file, and if you look at the top of the screen, that is the chart shown on a waveform, and you'd actually be able to count 18 stops across that. But again, at the very bottom, they're starting to get a little bit noisy. So if you needed to add noise reduction, you could use that to get those stops back. But you probably won't need them. You're probably more concerned about the highlight range, which of course you have 8 stops over in highlight. And if you can't expose with 16 stops, something's wrong.
I wouldn't mind touching upon something.
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind touching upon something while we're on that, just for especially any sort of students out there or anyone starting their career. If you can just pull up the chart. That last one? Yeah, so in terms of quality, every stop that you go down on this chart, the signal is becoming lower and lower. Obviously, it only manifests itself as noise in the bottom darkest stops. But if you have an 8-stop scene, at least put them in the top 10 stops. Unless you needlessly want to, there's some people that want to throw away information so that it can never be used in the shadows. I can appreciate the artistic argument for that, maybe. I'm not entirely on board with it as a colorist, because when we start working in that noise floor, it's extremely hard to key. It's quite hard to track. That data, as you go into those gravy stops, is extremely hard to work with and will be noisy. So if you have a low dynamic range scene, as a colorist, I would plead, while I have you all here in one room, I would encourage you not to go into those darker stops if you don't have to.
Yeah, because we can control it later.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. But again, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we would have been up here talking about 30% less stops even physically possible. And that's really remarkable, is in 2018, we're now dealing with sensors that have greater dynamic range than people ever thought. Then, the film argument doesn't even come close to this in terms of dynamic range. Another element or aspect to that is being able to have stops over and under and have an equal amount of stops. And people, when they shoot, tend to want equal over and under. And this is an example of 8 stops over, 8 stops under, which is going to give you tremendous range of paycheck stops of a usable 16. So the third myth, last point, is compression compromises resolution and color fidelity. So this is, although there's 150 people in the room, it's me and you, Stuart. We're talking right now, okay? We're just having a conversation. So basically, compression compromises resolution and color fidelity is a myth. And this goes into how I think Red is a different company. There's a lot of companies that make good cameras. There's a lot of companies that make good sensors. I actually am a huge fan of Aries sensor. I love the Vericam sensor. I think it's awesome. Taka and his team have totally dominated with the Vericam sensor. It's great. But what I think is awesome about the Red company as an anchor is Red code. And so workflow is a super powerful component. And when you're talking about workflow, that's a $200 reader with a card that goes over USB-C, and I can download an hour of material in about 24, 25 minutes over a couple of $100 of investment. That is the first cue to making things efficient in workflow. It's just the hardware itself should be inexpensive and easy to pack around in my backpack. And I was telling Stuart, I do 8K on my laptop all the time. I put this photo in for you, Stuart, because I really do it in my laptop because the technology is actually there. So if I were to show you this problem, here is a common problem. The DXL shoots at 24 frames per second in 8K mode at 5:1 compression. Red code is 5:1 compression. So it's effectively 5 times smaller than uncompressed, okay? Now, people have to shoot overcrank. They want to shoot more frames per second. So the question is, it's very common, is if I'm shooting overcrank, which image do you think would look the best? If I have to shoot 60 frames per second, is 8K 60 at 12:1, which is I'm forced to go to 12:1 for 8K 60, best? Is 7K at 10:1 best? Or is 6K at 7:1 best? Which do you think is the best result? Holler it out. What's that? 8K? What else? Who else? 7K? So you might be wondering, okay, well, which one is best? Because this is it's a fair question. And actually, a lot of customers say, I'm not really sure, should I shoot 8K higher compression or 6K lower compression? Well, this is what's happening with Red code. If you imagine a wedge, if you imagine a dynamic range of values of black to white, if I only have 2 points, like super low resolution, I'm going to show you the lowest resolution image in the world. Ready? There it is. 1 white pixel, 1 black pixel. That's the lowest resolution picture you've ever seen. And so if I have super low resolution and I have to go from white to black and I only have 2 values, that's what it looks like. Now, if I double those values, it looks like that. It looks a little bit closer, but it's still really chunky and very sharp and doesn't look smooth. If I double those values, it starts to get a little bit smoother. And you can imagine I could keep doubling and doubling and doubling, and eventually I'm going to achieve the image on the top where I have white to black. Well, how Red does this is with a compression technology called wavelets. Many of you maybe have heard the word compression and you don't like it because it sounds bad and it makes things look ugly. If you look at the image on the left is a wavelet compressed image, and the same image is compressed to the same size using JPEG, which is similar to MPEG. If I blow these up, they both look terrible, but notice how much more efficient the wavelet compression is. It gives the impression of dimensionality and depth, and it's way more efficient, even though both these images are the same size. MPEG and JPEG is very inefficient because it uses blocks. And when you use the word pixelization, which people use, which is not a real word, the actual word for the nerds alert is macro blocking. But if you call it pixelization, that's fine too. So pixelization is basically the blocking artifacts that are achieved through this. Go for it.
Can I jump on just for a sec?
Yeah.
I mean, just touching upon this whole compression thing. If you've ever gone to the cinema and seen a film, you've seen a digital cinema package, that's compressed. That is JPEG 2000 compressed, which I believe is that wavelet?
Similar to, yes, wavelet.
Yeah, so JPEG 2000 is wavelet compression, and that's used in every digital film you have ever seen in the cinema in your entire lives. ProRes is compressed. Even what people call uncompressed from Bayer pattern sensors, because a Bayer pattern sensor is a black and white sensor with a color filter in front of it, is 3-to-1 compressed. So 5-to-1 and 3-to-1, like you've got to think about these things relatively. We all have, when we think of compression, we think of YouTube, we think of Vimeo, we think of MP3, we think about fidelity in sound, in pictures being lost. This is different. And if you've ever seen a digital cinema package, a DCP of a film, it's the same concept.
So here's how it works. Imagine your image has a line here. This is going to be a 0 line. This is how wavelets work. And there are people way smarter than me that can explain this way better. But I'm not very smart, so I'm gonna dumb it way down so that we can kind of understand basically how wavelets work. Red is the only company in the world that compresses images this way. The image you actually have could be represented by these data points. So these are called coefficients. And you have a moment where the data tells you, put a pixel here, a pixel here, a pixel there. This is a face, this is a truck, this is a sky. Now, if we were to map these onto an image, we could just draw these lines, and this would be a very low resolution compressed image. But I have a few data points to be able to identify how the image works. If I double those data points, remember the wedge I showed earlier, all of a sudden the line can become a lot smoother. If I double them again, the line can't really get much smoother. If I double them again, notice that once I hit a certain threshold, I was able to replicate that wave, which is our signal, and even if I kept adding more and more data points, the wave doesn't get any smoother because they're so close together. Therefore, as Toby said, 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 5-to-1, I could make this uncompressed or I could make it 5-to-1, and the wave is the same image. So I don't actually get a cleaner, better picture because I'm compressing it far more efficiently. When you use MPEG, like ProRes or H.264, they have to use boxes, and the boxes do not behave this way. You have to have, if you want a really good image, you have to have very, very low compression for an image to look good using MPEG. But in wavelets, we just showed how very few points can produce the same result as very populated points, and this is how red code works and how DCPs work. A movie at a movie theater is only about 150 gigabytes. A whole feature is only about 150 gigabytes, and it looks pretty good. A 4K movie is only 150 gigs. It's pretty small because it uses this same principle. Well, red is taking the principle that we use to distribute films, and it's simply capturing them the same technology. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why don't other cameras take advantage of this? Well, because red patented it, and it's illegal. So that's why. So essentially, red owns the patent on wavelet compression of CMOS image capture with RAW. Now, you can compress your cameras using MPEG, which is why ProRes and AVC and XAVC are all codecs that people use, or DNX. But when it comes to wavelet compression, Red is the only company that can do that with a RAW file based on their patent. So now we're back to our question, which of these is better? And the answer goes back to a phrase that Toby, unaware, said, and that was the law of averages, or as you would say, law of averages. So the law of averages is basically this. Here is an 8K image at 12-to-1. Here is a 7K image compared to that, and I'm going to zoom into it. So I know Maria looks a little odd here because I'm doing a flop, but 6K on the left at 7-to-1 and 8K on the right. And notice that the 8K still looks smoother than the 6K. Can you feel, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you feel that the 8K, which is twice as compressed, is still smoother? And that is because, the images are basically, sorry, let me back up. The images are essentially having more pixels to average. When you have more pixels overall, it's always better to compress them more because they're more efficient. They have more range. It's those little wedges I was drawing. The more wedges you have, the smoother things become. So you might think that compression is a stronger influence than resolution, but actually the resolution feeds compression. And the higher resolution you have, the more efficient your compression becomes. Therefore, you need to compress it less to produce the same result. I'll say that again. When you have 8K images, you can increase the compression and get the same result. If you have 6K or 4K or 3K images, you can't afford to compress them because there's not enough pixels to average the waves across. So Stuart, that's why you can take the 8K DXL, you could shoot at 12:1 compression at 24 frames per second, and it would look as smooth as that image on the right. And this is zoomed way in, I think 700%. And you can't really tell a difference at 100%. You know, that would be very hard to see. And the point is, at 12:1 compression, your data rate drops in half. So you could take the same 8K, still have 8K, and work at 500 gigs an hour instead of 1 terabyte. Or you could drop it down to 2K and scale it down even. If you were going to go down to 2K, you could shoot it 15:1, 16:1 compression, and it would be a third the size. And these are experiments that sometimes people forget to do. Now, if you're made of money, then it doesn't matter. And if you have the resources of time and money, which all of you do, everything I just said is kind of moot, because you just shoot at 5:1 8K. But if you know someone who doesn't have unlimited funds and unlimited time, then shooting at 12:1 or 7:1 or more may be more efficient. The worst thing you can do, and there are meatballs out there that do this, the worst thing you can do is say, I'll take the 8K helium or the 8K Monstro and I'll shoot it in 4K mode. Do not. I mean, we were trying to say, if there's some sort of subjective reason, we don't want to argue with some artist, but no, that's just wrong. Don't do it. It's not going to help you. We can achieve what you want better with the 8K source as opposed to cutting it all down below the ankles and trying to run a marathon. It's just not going to happen. So 8K is totally the way to go. Throttle your compression based on your budget. That is totally... You have our permission to throttle your compression based on your budget.
And your acquisition resolution.
And your acquisition resolution. The more you can afford, shoot more. You have more malleability, more control as you go down. Do those concepts kind of make sense? Is that? Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, somehow we got to the end, and we did a pretty good job, I think. So good job. Cool. Good job. All right. So, do we have one question, one burning question? I'm sorry, Stuart, not you. Because you've taken up too much time in this panel. Anyone else have a question? There's one question back there. A mic is coming. Nice and loud for us.
What compression was the TV show shot at, given that it was
Great question.
8K?
5:1.
So 1 terabyte an hour.
Yeah, we had, well, I think, is that much? Yeah, we had about 120 terabytes of rushes for the show at our facility for the finishing, which was a lot of data. And for the lower compression ratios, we found that you needed a little bit more grunt as well. So the higher compression ratio is a little bit easier on the decompress side.
Yeah.
So we,
You mean in processing power?
Yeah, so I'm not only a colorist at Cheat, I'm also one of the owners, and I made a decision to invest in lots of shiny new hardware for this film, and we're now ready for 8K pipelines and 8K workflows. But yeah, it can be done on less.
And that's
it's just
why
a question of time.
The Red ecosystem allows for ProRes capture. So if you want, you can have the 8K captured as 4K ProRes or 4K DNX, and you're able to essentially retain almost all of the properties of the 8K.
Yeah, which actually reminds me, but you will lose certain functionality of working with RAW, which I've just realized I've completely
you
skimmed
lose
over.
a little bit. But
so like the photometric controls of exposure, color temperature, those things you'd have to get right when you're shooting ProRes. You'd have to get your color temperature right, you'd have to get your exposure, your ISO right.
But they're pros. They can do
it.
All right, I think that was good. I think that was one question. Thank you for the question. Thank you guys for having us. We appreciate it. Take care.